Okay, let's give it a start. So, hi everyone. Maybe if you could go live right now with your faces, that'd be really nice to say hello to Piergianna. And then when she starts her talk, we could go to gallery view. There, so nice to see people's faces. Very sweet. This is both a kind of very happy occasion and a very sad one. I mean, this is our last lecture of the spring semester. And it's our last time having Piergianna here. This has been a terrible semester in the sense that none of us having been in school. I think one of the huge advantages of the kind of these kind of young faculty members who come to the school for 2 years is to have this, just their sense of their presence, you know, causing terror and adding enlightenment in the classroom. And so just that sense of you have, I feel like we miss this kind of great opportunity. We sort of need a hologram of you that we could just kind of like light up on reviews. I want to say how exciting, let me briefly introduce those of you who don't know Piergianna Mazzocca. She got her bachelor at the University of the Andes in Merida, Venezuela, and then her master's science in architecture at the TU, the Berlage Center in the TU in Delft. And she is about to start her PhD at Cornell, which is an exciting place to send you off to. I wanted to mention that I think what's really interesting about kind of architecture, one of the things interesting about architectural academics is how fine these kind of distinctions are about people as they move into the discourse. And you can tell the difference between people who entered 5 years before and 5 years later. And I mean, for me, architectural intellectualism in architecture is really suspect. It's suspect because it's a business, and the business has been on a run for the last 20 years that rivals the Middle Kingdom in terms of just, you know, like money pouring into the profession. And when the intellectualism becomes suspect, it's because invariably what you see is very smart people kind of bending their minds around ideas in order to justify the form that their practice has taken. And so what I really like is, for me, in the last 5 years, and you see it in Adam Miller and particularly in Piergianna, like the sense that there's this new young generation that's entered into that world of kind of wealth and productivity with doubt about its efficacy, that looks around the kind of spectrum of architecture and says, wait, really is the problem that we're really solving with all of these commissions and all of this money at this moment the ones that we're actually solving? And so I find that incredibly heartening. And so the presence of that doubt coming from the youth within the discourse, to me, is just like an incredibly hopeful sign. So I just wanted to say, Piergianna, how much of a pleasure it's been to have you in the school and to have your voice in the school. Me personally, I'm going to miss it, but I think that it's really the start of a very interesting kind of front that's coming at us older architects in a way that I think will call a lot of things into question. I'm going to leave my introduction to you at that, because you're going to talk about wellness and a whole series of interesting issues that I think are crucial to the question of what we as architects do. So with that, if the rest of you could please join me in saying thank you to and welcoming Piergianna Mazzocca.
All right. Well, thank you, David. Let me just set this up real quick. And probably do this so that I don't get distracted. All right. Well, thank you, David, for that introduction, and thank you, and Leora and Clay for inviting me to share the work that I have been developing as the Emerging Scholar and Design Fellow. It is an honor and a very scary thing to be presenting last, but here we are. And somehow my first slide is not showing as it should, but I'm just gonna move forward. Let me begin by introducing myself and my position. I am an architect and a researcher, and as David already mentioned, I also hold the Emerging Scholar and Design Fellow position here at the School of Architecture. This position is the second of 2 recently established fellowships offering individuals that are at the beginning of their academic career in architecture, urban design, landscape architecture, or interior design the opportunity to develop a body of work in the context of teaching and research. The school particularly encourages its fellows to integrate their scholarly trajectory with its pedagogical agenda. The goal of the fellowship is to disseminate the work through a public event, which in my case is this public lecture and the online exhibition that just launched last Friday, entitled Good, Well, and Better. What I'm going to present today is a summary of such research and pedagogical project compressed in the results of 3 courses that I've taught in the past 2 years related to the medicalization of architecture. Presenting the summary has not been an easy task, not just because of the sheer quantity of stuff the students produce under my guidance, and also because of the insane amount of deliverables, but also because I wanted to show all of their work. I didn't do a good job at this, but I did collect it on an exhibition, which you can all visit at goodwellandbetter.com. So today, this is what I will be presenting instead. I'm going to start with an introduction that situates the work into a larger, broader context and how this context is important to understand what I do and investigate. I will then go over some important terminology and historical references that help introduce the methods by which the research and the students' work was framed. I will then go over some of the work produced in both the studios and seminars. And finally, I will take the opportunity to speculate on the relevance of the work in regards to a post-pandemic reality. I'm just going to start with an introduction to the persistence of goodness. Please expect a video playing throughout the entire length of the introduction. In the 2001-2002 winter issue of Cabinet magazine entitled Evil, a piece by philosopher and art critic Sven Olof Wallenstein addressed what he calls the persistence of goodness. In this essay, Wallenstein traces the connection between form and morality and how this connection has informed theories of significant form in art and architecture. Traditional aesthetics, he tells us in his essay, has always proposed that there is a necessary link between form and morality. That is, that the work of art is a precursor of a better moral order. These ideas, put forth in the work of English critics Clive Bell and Roger Fry, frame the understanding of significant forms as being both free and universal. Wallenstein notes how, from our contemporary standpoint, the underlying moral and political agenda found in the early stages of formalism might appear not just as an intriguing footnote in this history, but as formalism's major force. At this moment, it was assumed that any aesthetic enjoyment produced by significant form derived from its allure towards freedom and universality. And because of it, in Wallenstein's words, it was also the bearer of an idea of humanity. He expands, and I quote, "If everyone could see properly, without prejudices, form would give us a sense of community, a shared experience that would be able to bridge all barriers of class, language, ethnicity, culture, etc." End quote. Unsurprisingly, these ideas were present in both the political and aesthetic movements that emerged at the beginning of the 20th century. To know and to exercise a practice around form, design, or art was understood as an important task towards fixing the fractures in society. This is why Wallenstein warns us, early modern architecture cannot be read merely as a formal exercise, but rather as a carrier of a modernizing agenda. Embedded in its aesthetic apparatus, we can read a legitimizing discourse that speaks volumes of the political and social consciousness of early modernism. Pulling from a constellation of sources that varies from the residues of the arts and crafts insistence on a humanist practice opposed to mass commodification, to the early traces of a social engineering project based on science and medicine, Wallenstein tells us that for modernists, form and design were perceived as the perfect tool for the production of a healthy, well-behaved, and politically sound working class. Thus, the instrumental quality of design and form, and of architecture too, rendered visible modernity's implicit message, the making of an order and ordering, rather than the representation of a preceding order, as a way to amend the social and bodily differences in society. Equating material form to a particular political program seems today a hard thing to sustain. So why is it that in the sphere of design and architecture, this formula still holds such a grip within the discipline, both in academia and in practice? Why does it live on, not simply as an insinuation, but in many cases as a major force constantly invoked? Wallenstein, at the end of his essay, mentions that to address this issue by simply producing evil architecture might not yield as many results as perhaps reversing the accepted values that have contributed to the acceptance of goodness with a capital G. This reversal, he argues, could allow for the promotion of a more fluid and open-ended judgment of the good, which he implores must be read in lower cases. My reading of Wallenstein's The Persistence of Goodness outlines an invitation to the reversal of the accepted values that allow for the indisputability of goodness in architecture. It is by no means an acceptance of badness, an invitation to embrace bad architecture, or to harm people as a consequence, but rather as a form of interrogating the present state of architectural production and how this present state has come to be. This invitation has helped me frame my interrogations on architecture's representation of goodness and its biopolitical applications through architecture's relationship to health. This interest is part of an effort to reveal the doctrinal arrangements of space used to organize life, suppress otherness, and mute differences, in an attempt to identify forms of resistance to the uneven power relations that emerged from their abuse. But most importantly, this is part of an effort to promote a more democratic definition of biopolitics in architecture. So if a critique of goodness in architecture is a criticism of state power underpinned by the many cases of harm done by a scientific biopolitical basis, an embrace of goodness, or its democratic biopolitical counterpart, to borrow Andrei Novak's words, should be balanced by criticism of the world that emerges without it. This simply translates into the necessity to rethink the very idea of responsibility we have towards others. My research as the Emerging Scholar and Design Fellow unpacks the concepts of health ingrained in how architectural knowledge is produced and reproduced, practiced and theorized, and what new forms of architecture can emerge when the concepts, norms, and practices that have been rendered invisible by the assumption that health is a monolithic universal good are put into question. To do so, my work is focused on investigating the epistemic influence medicine has had in the production of architecture. Departing from a historical analysis of the metaphors, analogies, and images borrowed from medicine, my research identifies the objects and discourses that shape the built environment and the mechanisms used to describe it as they were stimulated by a pursuit of health. The video that has been playing in the background is Laszlo Moholy-Nagy's only abstract film, which synthesizes his attempts to visualize the act of seeing from multiple viewpoints. To continue, I will address what the medicalization of architecture is. To understand health in the context of architecture, one must first understand how modern considerations of health were introduced in the discipline. This introduction was only possible by the reliance architects had on the medical discourse emerging at the end of the 18th century and the medicalizing processes at the core of modernity. The interest stemming from such translations helps understanding how the expertise found in the medical sciences infiltrated into architecture and how the knowledge gained from this exchange served as a validating tool for the modernization of cities, buildings, and ultimately populations. But first, a distinction must be made between the medicine of species and the medicine of social spaces, referring to separate modalities of medical practice. The former is related to classifying diseases, diagnosing and treating patients, mainly in the family, and in a relationship agreed between a doctor and a patient. The latter is concerned with public health. Its actions include preventing outbreaks of epidemic diseases and general measures of hygiene. When I speak here about medicine, I am referring to the modality of medical practice that deals with the medicine of social spaces and public health, and the use of architecture as a disciplinary technology that enables such medicalizing processes in the first place. If one wants to define the social spaces, one needs to rationalize the routines that help to organize life, and in rethinking and transposing customary modes of action in response to the need to adapt to unfamiliar circumstances. These critical instruments, taken for the most part from the human sciences, were given the names of cultural models, regimes of practice, or types, and applied as norms to social groups. This process ensured a strong and scientific foundation for the definition of type in architecture. As George Tissot claims, and I quote, "Types are not only determined by institutions, prescribed by ideology, or guided by circumstance, but they have their own regularity, logic, and strategy." End quotes. The changes that ensued operated both at the level of theoretical discourse and architectural education and were intensified by the demands of new types of buildings that had no reference in previous traditional typologies. We see appear in this period types such as the hospital, the asylum, and the prison, the hospital for the sick, the asylum for the mad, and the prison for the criminal. Form, when adhered to specific moral standards, was seen as the instrument to elicit behavioral and societal change. Thus, these types, for example, were deemed necessary for reformation. Techniques for this were informed and reinforced by concerns with health and how this would help with the sanitation of cities, its social hygiene, and the public's health. So in the debate surrounding the operation of these new types, medicine played a very important role. The word type, as it was used in architecture, crystallized both health policies while also becoming a tool to organize and categorize architectural knowledge. Through time, the term was interpreted and appropriated by different generations of architects in different times, though their original purpose as both a discursive and operational tool for social reform rarely changed. In the mid-20th century, the emergence of a new form of medicine broke with the binary separation of the healthy and the ill, and replaced it with a continuous distribution of health/illness, an arrangement in which everyone is precariously healthy and precariously ill. This transformation saw, for example, the decline of the modern hospital as the type most commonly associated with health and the reformation of the sick. If diseases were in the hospital treated in a state of exile and enclosure, in the new emerging surveillance medicine, the empirical foundations of the hospital diluted towards the monitoring and surveillance of disease outside of the hospital's boundaries. This event points two important aspects of medicalization. The first one deals with the architectural and institutional manifestation of a new perception or new social representation of the nature of illness. And the second one deals with the spatial expansion of medical jurisdiction outside of the hospital. Thus, the expansion of a medicalizing process at the center, periphery, or adjacency to other types in both the domestic and public realms of life emerges. Anthony Vidler, at the beginning of Homes for Cyborgs, points to this process inside the domestic. He says, and I quote, "If for the first machine age, the preferred metaphor for the house was industrial, a machine for living in, the second machine age would perhaps privilege the medical, the house as one prosthesis and prophylactic." End quote. The home, thus, replaces the hospital in the new model of surveillance medicine. Up until this point, I have used the word medicalization many times, so I want to offer a definition. Peter Conrad, in The Medicalization of Society, argues that the clue to understanding the term lies indeed in definition. That is, a problem is redefined in medical terms, described using medical language, understood through the adoption of a medical framework, or treated with a medical intervention. The important thing, then, is that the object or issue under observation that is regarded as an illness or disease is not a medical problem. It simply needs to be defined as such. Definition, in this case, does not address the fact of whether a particular issue is or isn't a medical problem per se, and as Conrad suggests, this aspect is beyond the scope of his inquiries. and for the sake of full disclosure, beyond mind. Rather, the focus is given to the expansion of medical jurisdiction and its implications. For architects, it means understanding the implications of these processes in the built environment. So to study the medicalization of architecture means to excavate the traces of this process within the discipline and track the expansion of medical jurisdiction inside the terrain of architectural methods and procedures. From the garden city to the Ville Radieuse, from the sanatorium to the roof terrace, architecture's complicity with the betterment of our bodies, people, and societies stretches beyond those typologies that have dealt with healthcare directly to others where their relationship is not always so apparent or direct. It means to survey the intentions behind every object and the ideas behind every architectural type that leads to medicalization, and how these reify the clues about illness and the pursuit of health we see embedded in the spaces we inhabit. In every surface that turns into a ventilated corridor, a volume into a well-tempered room, ideas are crafted into an architecture where pathologies, or the fight against them, are registered, and where the truth about the human condition becomes visible. In short, such an investigation reveals the history of how architecture was instrumental to achieve the modern ideal of progress, both as an agent and facilitator through the medicalization of the population, of cities, and nature by championing health as the always elusive common good. Because the study of these processes reveals the doctrinal arrangements of space used as a preventive measure to ensure health, it also helps to identify the medicalizing processes enabled by architecture. But since health is a word depleted with value judgment and unattainable assumptions, it is a term that also speaks about power and privilege as much as the state of ultimate well-being. As Jonathan Metzl and Anna Kirkland argue, and I quote, "Health is a desire state, but it is also a prescribed state and an ideological position." End quote. Therefore, appealing to health allows for a set of moral assumptions to remain unquestioned and for medicalization to permeate unchecked into the discourse of architecture. My work concentrates on this history by examining the cultural landscapes of domestic and medical typologies, and by exploring how architectural knowledge is formed when framed through its relationship with the medical sciences. I will now show you how this investigation has translated into my teaching. This historical consciousness, coupled with the desire to participate actively in the discipline, has helped define my work's methodology, my research, and my pedagogical projects. I believe that understanding design as a way of engaging with this history helps map a terrain of intervention. Once we recognized just how much these processes are embedded within our practice, we might have a better awareness of how our concerns regarding bodies, health, and collective responsibilities shape space and its production. These concerns are at the core of both the studios and seminars that I've taught here at UT. In them, I have encouraged students to read space, buildings, and urban fragments by interrogating the medicalizing processes at the core of both medical and non-medical architectural types and the vocabulary we use as architects. I believe that both play an important role in finding non-normalizing ways of doing that might exist outside of a modernist paradigm regarding health. The two formats that have framed this research, the seminar and the studio, have allowed me to approach this topic from the point of view of history and typology, but also through the point of view of discourse and design. In broad terms, the studios and seminars seek to find design and discursive strategies by answering the following questions. Can we care about health without perpetuating the patronizing and condescending tone of modernist architects? Can we intervene in communities without sanitizing their history, their culture, their bodies? Can we pursue a health agenda without falling in the traps of a politically correct justification, a branding strategy, or in medical imperialism? To answer this, we have interrogated and intervened in spatial types outside of traditional medical architectures, and we have privileged concepts of care rather than those strictly coming from medicine. The theory seminar, For the Better, explored the relationship between architecture and medical knowledge through a study of the modes of observation and representation imported from the medical sciences. We are familiar with how medical knowledge has been understood in architecture through the impact it had on cities and in the interior configuration of domestic spaces. However, a less known history is the one that tells us how architects also recognized in medicine an innovative way to understand and reproduce knowledge generated within its practice. According to this, architectural knowledge could also be generated scientifically, preceding a way of thinking equivalent to methods of clinical observation, the very same method from which medical knowledge is generated. This new way of seeing synthesized experience into abstraction, opening architecture to the medical gaze. The opening up of architecture to the influence of medicine and science brought the introduction of metaphors, analogies, images, and words that have had a direct influence on shaping the built environment and the mechanisms we use to describe it. The most exemplary ones may be the cultural history behind the concept of type, as investigated by George Tissot, or the incorporation of words such as circulation into the architect's lexicon, as explored by Adrian Forty, the elements of architecture used to combat disease, as explored by Margaret Campbell, or the aesthetics of the X-ray, as claimed by Beatriz Colomina. And finally, the deployment of mechanisms of othering when justified by racial and health concerns, as Fabiola Lopez Duran argues. Certainly, this seminar expands on the work of previous scholars who have done foundational work on the tangled and contested history of medicine and architecture. Though mainly concerned with history, the seminar did not follow a conventional historical survey of buildings or architects, but rather it looked for a discontinuous thread where we could point to the episodes where the discipline had flirtations with medicine. This allowed making little incisions to bring up stories, words, and definitions that have characterized the history of modernism as it is taught in architectural education. The seminar also recognized how contemporary architectural discourse is somehow affected in several degrees and hues by different modes of rationalization, disciplining of the body, and subject formation that have remained uncontested. It was therefore a goal of the seminar to serve as a surgical tool to reveal them. This, we realized, wasn't a function of stepping outside of these processes once and for all, but to inhabit this history in a more thoughtful way. In our weekly Tuesday evening seminar meetings, the students and I analyzed and discussed a broad range of readings. Although the leading thematic of the readings revolved around modern architecture, some of the readings helped map current theoretical interests regarding health and domestic space, and what I referred to before as the passing from a form of exile and enclosure medicine to the monitoring and surveillance medicine of today. All these observations point to the pervasive effect the reliance on medicine instills into the production of architecture, and how bodies and spaces are therefore still created through the experience of a constructed institutional setting in which medical perception gives us the rigor to observe. Additionally, students explored each class theme through a set of words that build up the seminar's glossary and a specific case study that relates to the readings. Using the assigned words, readings, and themes as a point of departure, students developed an audiovisual glossary. As the final output of the seminar, these audiovisual dictionary type entries seek to make visible this sometimes invisible history. Taking a cue from Adam Curtis' The Century of the Self, these short entries, using archival footage and amateur videos, seek to make connections between the words we think we know and the medical associations they elicit. By arranging disparate images and footage next to literal dictionary definitions, the audiovisual entries disclose as subjective reading, and evaluation of the same terms we have assumed as neutrally objective. They are edited to be fast-paced, though not easily comprehensible at first watch. Here is current student Kendall Fleischer's entry for the word body.
Every successful member of a society is aware of the meaning of a large number of gestures and facial expressions. Many of us could construct a dictionary of nonverbal communication. We are thus able to convey a wide range of attitudes by the way we use our bodies.
That's right. You know what people want. Take yourself, for example. How do you like to come home to an easy chair? A pleasant, warming fire in the fireplace. Just relax with your slippers. Solid comfort. Yes, comfort is mighty important to you and to a lot of other people. That's one of the things you and lots of other people want.
If I may say so, these are little do-it-yourself baby versions of the Century of the Self, gone a tiny bit wrong, but also a little bit delightful. All right, so if the seminar has focused or focuses on words, the studios are focused on deconstructing architectural types and cities. Similar to the seminar, the design studios, Good, Well, Better, have also explored the representation of health in architecture. But this time, this exploration is done by individuating the strategies, types, and infrastructures that, informed by medical discourses, were deployed and instituted as the actual techniques of its reification. Divided into two parts that promiscuously inform one another, the studios are first a collective attempt at deconstructing a city, and through its architectural form, and later individual contributions in which students put forward personal design positions. On the first iteration of the studio, the city was Chicago, and on the second, it was Austin. In the fall of 2020, the studio interrogated the organization of welfare and public assistance in the context of Austin, Texas, amidst a global pandemic. Similar to the fall of 2019, students were encouraged to respond to this collective site by questioning the spatial types that directly or indirectly deal with the city's medicalizing processes. The types studied belonged to these two criteria: sustenance and care. Types related to sustenance were those dealing with food production, markets, convenience stores, waste management, infrastructure and sanitation, landfill operations, laundromats, laundry services, and water management. Whereas types related to care were those addressing clinics, urgent care clinics, childcare, senior, elderly, and disabled care, and cemeteries. On the slide, you can see the drawings the students produced for the survey assignment of the city of Austin. For the Chicago survey, seen here in the slide, the students for the fall 2019 studio defined and identified architectural and urban types, as well as public infrastructures and legal documents labeled as public forms of health present in the city. The students studied wastewater management infrastructures, public spaces, the spaces in and around public schools, correctional facilities, and the city's fire code. As the site of their research, students investigated these types by connecting similarities between spatial relationships at multiple scales and the systems that govern them through the act of drawing and storytelling. Each drawing encapsulates a short story about the conditions involved in their creation. As opposed to conventional maps of the city, each fragment provokes speculative explorations. Drawn at different scales, each fragment reveals the networks used to enable both the urbanization and medicalization of the city and its population. Thus, each survey exercise interrogates each type's relationship to infrastructure, labor, and urbanization of both the city and the territory, rather than focusing only on its architectural dimension. The following is an example of one survey exercise by students Giulia Martinelli and Ezekiel Jones from the fall of 2020. The series of maps examines the rituals and devices present at 3 scales within the network of landfills. The domestic, which centers around the home, investigates trash cans under sinks and the garbage disposals. The urban focuses on alleys in the downtown commercial area of Austin, and the rural, which captures parts of a working landfill. The students depict these 3 types, the house, the alley, and the landfill, as integral to an interrelational system, while emphasizing the tools of concealment employed within the systems as something that unites them all. Starting at the suburban scale, the home is the first site to survey. Tools of concealment are represented in black pochette at the perspectival scale, seen as a reduction, while the trash they conceal is represented as a sickly ochre. The varying scales show concealment from respective parties increasing in intimacy as one zooms in. The isometric views that disclose the scale at which the perspectival images operate show a clear, unobstructed systematization and scope. This is achieved by the privilege towards dimensional objectivity and distance that the isometric drawings afford. The drawings seek to pay attention to the centralized industrialization of garbage disposal and the acts of concealment limiting individualized engagement with waste streams. For the students, this perpetuates harmful effects of anthropocentric thinking regarding the use of resources. Giulia and Zeke further reflect that the landfill, considered through the subjective lens of an episteme, is an important cultural byproduct that exists beyond its sanitary practicality. They conclude that the landfill, in its various forms and operating at various scales, is a space of othering, that which society sees as no longer worthy of use. Through their drawings, Giulia and Zeke reclaim the landfill's cultural value. In their analysis, they reveal that a landfill is more than a singular landscape object, but instead a complicated network meant to displace and conceal waste from human contact. Thus, this concealment allows for complicated economic, political, and societal operations that reinforce prescribed ideals about sanitation throughout time. They finally conclude that landfills are critical civic spaces that should be seen as such, and that a rethinking about their role in life should play a fundamental role in our behaviors to determine what is waste and what is resource. For more on Giulia and Zeke's fascinating investigation on landfills and their take on the future of this type, I encourage you to visit the exhibition's website to watch how the survey assignment sets up the tone for an amazing final project. As you can see, the survey assignments help define a research question and a theoretical position regarding each type. The survey exercises also help situate the design project as at one of the scales investigated in the survey. By taking the sites as a given, students then project strategies that reconsider this type's established arrangement of space and the consequences this may have in the construction of diverse concepts of public health. This design research projects act as critical forms of documentation and of representation. I will now show you Jenny Adair's and Lexi Benton's final project for the fall 2020 studio. In Jenny and Lexi's project, the existing public-private hybrid healthcare system in the United States is interrogated as a convoluted structure of care. The site of their analysis is the fragmented system of single-use franchised urgent care centers, which in the context of Austin are located in more affluent and economically stable neighborhoods. They argue that this decentralized network places more responsibility on the patient by requiring them to track their medical history, which can lead to information loss and lower quality care. Between utopia and dystopia, Jenny and Lexi reflect on the current state of healthcare policy in the United States. With the onset of the COVID-19 pandemic and continually increasing support for universal health coverage, they imagine a future where the United States enacts a systemic change to health policy. They propose creating the Austin Medical Corpus as supplemental to an improved network of healthcare. The corpus represents data access while claiming new territory for architectural innovation, separate from an interior spatial consequence. Through rearranged relationships between the patient and information gatekept in the existing system, Jenny and Lexi shift the medical gaze from the expert upon the patient to a collective gaze upon the health of the body politique. I will present Jenny and Lexi's project almost in its full length, because I believe that in their work, a new form of architectural agency is made explicit. I will elaborate what I mean by this in my conclusion.
With the onset of the COVID-19 pandemic and continually increasing support for universal health coverage, it is easy to imagine a future where the United States enacts a systemic change to health policy. The proposed National Healthcare Act of 2035 acts as a framework to propose new clinical aesthetics and modes of health data distribution in the United States. The legislation contains 3 parts. 1. The creation of U.S. national healthcare, a universal single-payer health insurance program. 2. The creation of a national medical corpus, a unitary health record archive. And 3. Urgent care reformation, the transformation of urgent care centers into public health entities. Implementation of the national medical corpus and urgent care reformation is left up to the states. In the case of Texas, medical data is made accessible through the use of kiosks, providing access to the digital medical archive. Existing exterior urgent care branding strategies, which once served to capture patients within a commercialized system, are reappropriated to form a unified identity for the corpus. Infographics are applied to the billboards and throughout the city, broadcasting medical data collected from the new system. The visual strategy contextualizes health conditions within place, and redistributes power dynamics by shifting the medical gaze from the expert upon the patient, to a collective gaze upon the health of the body politic. By reimagining the exterior condition, the vernacular American marketing language transforms urgent care centers into access points for public knowledge, rendering the internal workings of the healthcare system visible, and therefore encouraging patients to engage with the transparent system. Historically, healthcare providers have utilized various incompatible e-health software. The National Medical Corpus acts as a public service, by storing medical data within a centralized system. The archive contains individual medical records which are agglomerated to form localized medical corpuses, that embody the health of the city. In the case of Austin, the Austin Medical Corpus database is formalized utilizing a kiosk typology, an architecture tied to information, in order to create a physical presence accessible throughout the city. Austin Medical Corpus kiosks are located at frequented public spaces away from medical locations, in places such as parks, grocery stores, convenience stores, and pedestrian streets. Through anti-clinical materiality and a tactile, human-driven interior condition, the Austin Medical Corpus kiosk challenges the traditional medical aesthetic. On the exterior, the kiosks take on a simple geometric form, acting as a shed. The green surfaces and light serve as an identifiable symbol and tie to associations between the color and health. The facades display an updated painted record of the number of times the corpus has been accessed through each location. The interior utilizes foam, a material typically rejected in medical settings, to create a space that adapts to the body and behavior of users, while remaining ambiguous and non-prescriptive. Cuts in the foam structure create opportunities for materially responsive, idiosyncratic placement of personal objects, and for the potential to occupy the crevices. The experience of accessing medical records within the kiosk is discreet and comfortable, in contrast to the vulnerable experience caused by the public display of symptoms and transactions found in commercialized urgent care centers. Although the foam is antimicrobial and raised on a shallow concrete plinth to prevent overt contamination, the inability to completely sanitize the porous material brings into question the acceptance of universal environmental sterilization. The exterior urgent care branding rhetoric is appropriated and transformed, through the addition of billboard facades to existing urgent care centers, to create a uniform, non-commercialized identity. The bright green facades tie to the Austin Medical Corpus kiosks, and stand in contrast to beige commercial spaces. The decorated shed is exaggerated via two-dimensional surfaces, creating forced perspectives, through the application of a trompe-l'oeil painting technique. Artificially angled infographics neutrally broadcast, and subsequently call attention to, the top health concerns for the local area, as collected from the archive. Instead of favoring the street, the data prioritizes a variety of views and subjective encounters, through perspective-corrected projections, oriented towards the occupant experience. A ladder, with its aesthetic of maintenance, is incorporated into each rebrand, for the bi-weekly ritual of repainting the billboards with updated statistics. The act of maintenance is made transparent through celebrated artifacts, that serve as evidence of this living digital organism. Additionally, infographics are incorporated onto surfaces throughout Austin outside of medical contexts, in order to engage and inform the public. Austin Medical Corpus rejects the grand narrative of modernity complicit in creating subjects. The project accepts architecture's incapability in solving interpersonal inadequacies that arise from a broken healthcare system in the United States. Modernist architectural attempts at alleviating healthcare's fragmentation and impersonal nature exacerbate the machine-oriented tradition, and only serve to replicate the dysfunctional framework via biopolitical instruments. The corpus presents a self-sustaining modality, which serves to supplement an improved network of healthcare by representing data access, claiming new territory for architectural innovation separate from interior spatial consequence, through rearranged relationships between the patient and information gatekept in the existing system. By proposing the implementation of the Healthcare Act of 2035 through a multitude of scales, health data is reclaimed by the public and consumable within the city's context, and a new, more unified, functional, and equitable healthcare system emerges.
Jenny and Lexi's take on public health is one related to ideas of knowledge and how and where this knowledge is provided, given, and shared. It invites to consider a re-evaluation of the different political, social, and human subjectivities that are supported and excluded from this process, and how through the reappropriation of the system by the public, and alternative, non-medical typologies related to obsolete systems of knowledge makes access to medical knowledge a more equitable right. For more on Jenny and Lexi's work, and of course, for more of the work from all of the students, please visit the exhibition's website. I would like to finish by addressing what I think the work of my fellowship and students is proposing, which is a positive and democratic take on biopolitics. This is what the exhibition Good, Well, and Better is really trying to point at. Biopolitics is the term used to describe the disciplinary processes that organize and administer life. This concept, which has been used and developed in social theory since Michel Foucault, examines the strategies and mechanisms through which human life processes are managed under regimes of authority over knowledge, power, and the production of subjectivities. Following Foucault's framing of the term, biopolitics became an important concept to understand the changes brought through modernity. From the power over life and death exercised by a sovereign, we move towards a form of power where the state assured the health and productivity of populations. Since modernity, human beings have expanded and distributed the power and the knowledge that allowed them to discipline themselves. These strategies, sometimes hidden and other times visible, have been executed through the policies and the spaces regulating and controlling daily life. If these changes are key to understanding the political and ideological dimensions of the health policies that brought us vaccines, penicillin, and public health infrastructure, they have at the same time allowed us to investigate the various ways by which racially engendered motivated systems of othering were justified through dangerous medical and scientific couplings, known as social hygiene and eugenics, and how architecture has been complicit with those same systems of oppression and normalization. On this, please read Fabiola Lopez Duran's Eugenics in the Garden, where she examines the eugenic dimensions of modernism in urban design and architecture in Latin America. It is crucial to understand that biopolitics, in both its critiques and analytical frameworks, exist within these contradictions and conflicts. What is left of this contested history is a present condition filled with uneven development and the rubble of past systems of medical order and neoliberal management. This past year has been a lesson on this. To borrow from Andrzej Nowak again, and I quote, "Freedom from biopolitical state interference did not result in a decrease in the amount of state power, but only in an increase in its irresponsibility." In light of this, it is worth considering a relational version of biopolitics where we can enact combined efforts to the health of populations without increasing forms of oppression, abuse, or suffering. In a spatial and architectural context, this translates into the need to rethink the agency of architecture and the responsibility we have towards others. In his late work, Foucault directed his attention to notions of truth and care. He combined the care of the individual with collective care by a desired shared knowledge and the distribution of truth in ways that do not use force to achieve compliance. Following this position, we could move away from discipline towards responsibility, toward others and ourselves. And in this current moment, architecture has a lot of room to act. Much has been said about the post-pandemic open plan office spaces of white-collar work, of apartment buildings, of public space, and outdoor dining, but little about the spaces where essential work happens. The pandemic has revealed not a struggle in the spaces of capital, but a struggle in the spaces of wage labor in vital supply chains, hospitals, and basic infrastructures. This means addressing what the pandemic points to, the social inequities and systemic flaws that have been revealed by the measures put into place to protect those very systems and the populations they serve. If as architects, we were to take on this challenge by merely focusing on new ways of keeping social distance, or how we navigate buildings, or how we can minimize contact with surfaces and others, we would be missing the point. We would be pathologizing space in the same way as modernist architects pathologized the architecture at the end of the 19th century. And by doing so, the people inside the very buildings they proposed to sanitize. We need to ask better questions. What is actually needed, and how can we spatialize our response? Indeed, this has been the biggest concern regarding medicalization in the pre-pandemic world, the pathologizing of everything. In such an exacerbated state, human differences are transformed into pathologies, turning normal life events into medical events. We need to be more discerning. Peter Conrad warns in the final chapter of his book, The Medicalization of Society, that, and I quote, "The great danger here is that transforming all difference into pathology diminishes our tolerance for and appreciation of the diversity of human life," end quote. If, as Andrzej Nowak claims, our neoliberal societies have forgotten about the fact that naked life exists, then we need to remember that it requires for its substance the positive, democratic biopolitics of a functioning public health system, and that the materiality and biology of the body is something to be taken into account." End quote. But when we do so, we must remember that health and architecture's responses to health have been historically flawed. Much has been said about architecture and health, so much that it might seem that every health-related research is first and foremost in the service of better
Attempts to
health.
mitigate the healthcare system through architecture enforce existing
But
inequities.
what this intention seems to
It is
overlook
necessary to
is
perceive
that
an
such
alternative
considerations
system.
must bring into question a deeper understanding of health beyond its designated goal. To negotiate our willingness for better environments and desire for the common good, we must expand our field of inquiry. First and foremost, we must ask better questions. If it is health that is wanted,
To suppress the habitual,
what kind of
to
health are
understand
we
and challenge
discussing?
the imperceptible forces
According to
behind
each
consumption
uncontested
and
assumption,
capitalistic principles,
under what
and
needs
unknowing
is it
the
achievable,
standards we live by,
and whose
it is
authority
possible to
and
acknowledge the
agency are we
potential in a
promoting?
reformatting of the system.
Goodwill.
Engaging with this and other critiques of health have driven the set of interrogations central to the aims of my fellowship work and the exhibition that catalogs it, placing architecture's representation of goodness and its biopolitical applications at its core. If it demands a renewal of our thinking about the biopolitical, it is totally intentional. If it demands an expanded notion of health, so be it. Let us do good, but in lower cases. As a fellow and young scholar, I find myself in the privileged position to question the inherited practices in architectural education, where health is still accepted as an immutable universal value. The conversations and work that have emerged from my fellowship work try to depict new considerations on public health that range from the object to the materials we used, but also to questions of environmental justice, equity, and access to all. Before I finish, I would like to take the opportunity to thank UT Austin School of Architecture for the opportunity and support that I have received as its first formal Emerging Scholar in Design Fellow, and for the direction the school has taken in supporting, fostering, and expanding the role that young scholars play in the definition of future forms of architectural education. I would also like to thank Mariam Adamji for her dedicated work in helping me design and curate the Good, Well, and Better online exhibition. Mariam is the quintessential and exceptional UT student. To Jacob Dasuda, Kendall Fleischer, and Jin Yu Su for their contributions to the exhibition's glossary, to Adam Miller and Francisco Gomez for reviewing and commenting on the exhibited work, and of course, to all the students that participated in the Good, Well, Better studios and trusted in my guidance. I owe them a debt of gratitude. And if you want to see all the work with it, please visit goodwellandbetter.com. Thank you. That's all.
Thank you, Piergianna, for the amazing lecture and for the work over the last couple of years. It's really nice to see it all kind of come together in this really deeply thoughtful and timely narrative that you've put together. I feel like this work is incredibly important and also really exciting to see where it's going to go. So congratulations.
Thank you.
Can you field a few questions?
Yes, of course.
Yeah, great. If there's a question, you can raise your hand, put it in the chat. You know the drill after so many lectures this semester.
It's also okay if there are no questions.
Oh, I'm sure there are questions. I can't imagine there aren't questions.
I think Michelle
Paddington has a question.
Yeah, I don't know if this is quite a question, although it ended in a question at the end. I'm just so intrigued that I wish we had hours and days to have a conversation about this, because this is also a subject that I worked on from a very different viewpoint. And I find your viewpoint way more interesting than the one that I worked on for many, many years. And before I get to that, I just want to say the tragedy of all this is that not every student here at the School of Architecture had a chance to study with you. I think that would have been an incredible experience for all of them and not to be missed. I know that many of the students who've studied with you have written me individually to say that you changed their life here. So we owe you a lot. And I'm just sort of brokenhearted that we haven't been able to have sort of like the big, robust discussion that we should be having on this material, particularly around the exhibition. I'm so intrigued by the way that you opened and basically talking about these sort of like these splinters, these switches, these transforms between the way that we think about and the way we've architecturalized, health and illness, and if you think about sort of my narrowness of looking at it has been very much at the turn of the 20th century was where a lot of those switches really began to occur. If we start to think about how the sanitarium was originally for the ill, it was originally for the tubercular. And then at the turn of the 20th century, we began to turn the sanitarium into a model of health that then proliferated out there in architecture. We think about Alexander Jackson Downing as the one who brought porches to this country, but it was really the sanatorium that brought porches to this country in a way of sort of like switching from being for the ill to then all of those techniques suddenly being a prophylactic measure that was about the prevention of illness and the creation of health. So there's a fascinating history there. There's a fascinating history with the very different ways that we embodied the architecture of epidemics versus chronic disease, and they have very different kinds of responses. And I think the part that interests me the most, which makes me regret that I haven't been working with you for the last 2 years, but I'm going to continue in this conversation, has been the moments when things ratchet into place and the reasons why they ratchet into place, and we can't sort of like find a way out of them. And almost all of the things that we can think about that ratchet into a place, which have to do with the response of the human body, whether it's the way that we think about enclosure, whether it's the way that we think about the systems surrounding the body, have reasons that were predicated on the medical, but more in terms of instrumentalizing the medical in order to perhaps serve, let's just say, a particular capitalist need. There was a variety of other things that the medical was a Trojan horse for allowing that to be instituted. But I guess the part that amazes me the most is the way that now you're sort of going in the opposite direction from that, not so much how all this has manifested in the way that we design and operate our buildings, but beginning to think about how architecture can be that switch or that intervening aspect on the way that sort of we operate, our systems, our human systems, our urban system, all of that. So this is the part I'm fascinated with. So if I'm left with a question, it's like, what's next? What are you going to do your PhD on? How are we going to stay involved? Please tell me you're continuing in this arena.
Well, thank you. I would say that yes, this work will continue, and it has always been there. There have been different iterations of this, not only in the research at UT, but also from my master's thesis, and later also the courses I taught at Rice University. And they will continue to be part of my PhD proposal. I'm very much interested, as you mentioned, in how medicine has helped frame or shape architectural knowledge at different moments and at different times, especially when it regards the different social representations of illness and then how they're manifested spatially, right? Right now, and what I have, let's say, promoted as my doctoral research has to do with how this medical imperialism and the baton that the medical sciences hold has been translated to other geographies. Obviously, this research, the way I'm being critical of it is, or critical of myself, is that probably this is, a Western interpretation of medicalization translated for a Western audience. And so the way I'm trying to think about it more broadly is to understand how these regimes of practice that come from the medical sciences have been translated and incorporated elsewhere in the world, particularly in the case of South America. In South America, also in the early 20th century, there has been a modality of medical practice called social medicine, and how it has been used as a way of, both in urban planning and in architecture, as a way of sanitizing cities, etc. This work, of course, expands on the work of Fabiola Lopez Duran, who has already done a lot of this work in the context of Brasilia and Argentina. But in my case, if she has, let's say, framed the medical translations through eugenics and social hygiene in these two contexts, in my case, I'm trying to think about it in the context of social medicine, in the context of Venezuela and Chile, in which, a conglomeration of healthcare policies and socialist countries are using then the concepts of social medicine as a way of gaining political prominence and leverage and things like that. So I'm on that spectrum right now, and obviously hopefully this will continue and it will narrow down. Right now it feels too broad, but I have 6 years ahead of me to continue this, so there will be more on this to come.
Thank you, and we want to be a part of all of that. So
well, you have already been a part of this. You have given me the platform to pursue this, which I'm totally grateful for.
We're lucky. We're the lucky ones here.
Well, thank you.
Are there other questions? It's okay.
That's all right.
Maybe as a closer, I'll ask one, Piergianna, if you don't mind. How does this, and it goes to the question that you probably think I'm going to ask, which is about like the instrumentalization of these topics, right? In terms of the language of architecture and the tools and methods of architecture. So maybe kind of as a parallel to that question, how do you think it affects the definition of expertise and how it's deployed in architecture?
No, that's a good question. I have also been asking myself this, and that's also why I feel like, especially during the pandemic, right? Like, as being someone who's always fearful of, the political leverage in biopolitics and its instrumentalization, keep thinking, hey, whoa, careful, right? Let's not repeat and let's not do the same. I still believe a lot in expertise, right? I think that most of the scholars that I referenced throughout the lecture, Peter Conrad, Jonathan Metzl, and Anna Kirkland, it's not like we're against health or against the medical sciences, we still believe in vaccines, but then, how we opt in and out must be a choice, right? That we consciously do, right? That it's not a choice that it's taken by others, right? In a sort of, in a way in which we get dispossessed by our own human agency, right? So I would say that is my relationship to expertise. I do trust it, and I, do encourage to review it, to revise it, and take it into consideration. but at the same time, it's just trying to understand that, yes, there is the expertise of the doctor, but then there is also the expertise of the architect, right? So can we just, be in equal terms, right? I think like one of the biggest, or I would say, I don't know, I'm not like a historical judge here, but but if I would say that something that I always found weird about the history of architecture and medicine is how like the doctor became a prominent figure, right? In terms of that, yeah, that the concepts coming from there were never, let's say, reflected on, or trying to be proven, or I don't know, like there are examples of this, of course. With the sanatorium, for example, which not only had like a huge influence in terms of the aesthetics of architecture, but also in the kind of, moral project of architecture, its humanistic purpose, right? If we think about the sanatorium as being that prophylactic device and therapeutic instrument, right, to make the tuberculosis patients better, it didn't do so. The patients that were advanced in their disease died. Many, and Beatriz Colomina has, fascinating accounts of the experience of patients in the sanatorium. And one of the most shocking one is how, patients committed suicide from the roof terraces, right? So nurses in the end had to close them, right? Because it was a lie that just by sitting outside on the roof terrace, you would get cured, right? So in that case, the expertise was the doctor, not in the architecture, right? Or what was able to cure was that realm, not the architecture. Architecture just sometimes even accelerated that, right? Like if you are thinking about having a pulmonary disease and sitting outside and the gelid and super cold environment in the Swiss Alps, then of course, things would get even worse. So anyways, it is that. It's just like putting things in a more relational understanding, right? And as I mentioned in the lecture, like who are we advocating for? Are we advocating for the patient, or in the case of the US, the medical, industrial, pharmaceutical industry, right? Which has its own agenda, its own motives and everything, not precisely the idea that we must have, that we could have of health, right?
Fantastic. That's the beginning of maybe a whole new series of discussions and lectures that we'll have to follow up on as you proceed with your work in the future. And I really look forward to it as somebody who's had the pleasure of chatting with you over the last couple of years. So thank you so much. And if there are no more questions, I think we're about quarter till 2. So maybe that's a good place to maybe just put a pin in the discussion, and we'll pick it up again, so hopefully in person in the very near future.
Yeah, I hope so too.
Great.
Well, thank you.
Thank you, Piergianna. And thank you to everyone for joining us today. And we look forward to seeing you in the fall for the next lecture series. That's a wrap, I guess. See you soon.